Everything looked normal at the Chinese Grand Prix. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Because in just one race weekend, the brand new 2026 Formula One regulations started falling apart in front of everyone. Max Verstappen retired. Fernando Alonso retired. 2 McLaren cars didn't even make it to the starting grid. And the season has only completed 2 races. That is the shocking part. The FIA spent years designing these rules. They promised closer racing, smarter aerodynamics, a revolutionary hybrid system that would define the future of Formula One. But in Shanghai, something else happened. Electrical failures. Cars vibrating uncontrollably. Teams completely lost with the new technology. And one moment that may explain why Verstappen was absolutely furious after the race. Because while several teams were struggling just to survive the Grand Prix, one team looked almost untouchable. Mercedes. A dominant 1-2 finish. A car that seemed to understand the new rules better than anyone else. Which raises a very uncomfortable question inside the paddock. Did the FIA accidentally create a rulebook that only a few teams truly understand? If that is true, the entire competitive balance of Formula One could be about to explode. Drivers are already frustrated. Engineers are quietly worried. And after the chaos in China, the governing body might already be under pressure. But there is one detail from that race that almost nobody noticed. A small technical change hidden inside the 2026 regulations. A detail that might explain the chaos in Shanghai, and why Verstappen's frustration could be only the beginning. Right after the checkered flag dropped in Shanghai, something unusual started happening inside the Formula One paddock. The conversations were not only about the race. They were about the rules. Because the Chinese Grand Prix was supposed to be the moment where the new era of Formula One finally proved itself. Instead, it exposed cracks that nobody expected to see this early in the season. The 2026 regulations are the biggest reset the sport has experienced in years. Completely new power units. Completely new aerodynamic philosophy. And one change that completely altered how drivers attack every lap. The removal of DRS. For more than a decade, DRS was Formula One's main overtaking tool. Simple. Press a button, the rear wing opens, and the car gains speed on the straight. But the FIA wanted something more advanced. Something that looked less artificial. So they replaced it with a much more complex system. Active aerodynamics. Now the cars constantly change their aerodynamic configuration throughout the lap. On the straights, the wings open to reduce drag and increase top speed. In the corners, they close again to generate maximum downforce. In theory, it sounds brilliant. More efficient cars. Less dirty air. Longer wheel-to-wheel battles. But the Chinese Grand Prix revealed the hidden problem behind this idea. When a system becomes too complex, everything has to work perfectly. The aerodynamics must be stable. The hybrid system must deliver energy exactly when needed. The cooling must handle the extra electrical load. And the software controlling these transitions must react instantly. If even one of those elements fails, the entire car can fall apart. That is exactly what we saw in Shanghai. Max Verstappen was forced to retire after a failure in the energy recovery system, a key component of the new hybrid architecture. Fernando Alonso also retired after severe vibrations made the Aston Martin impossible to control safely. And McLaren suffered perhaps the most shocking moment of the entire weekend. Neither Lando Norris nor Oscar Piastri even started the race due to electrical power unit problems. 2 cars eliminated before the race even began. For a team expected to fight for podiums, that is a disaster. But the bigger concern was what those failures revealed. These new cars are extremely sensitive machines. Small electrical issues. Small aerodynamic imbalances. Small cooling problems. Any one of them can suddenly end a race. Drivers are beginning to feel that sensitivity inside the cockpit. Because the 2026 cars behave very differently from the previous generation. Drivers must constantly manage hybrid energy, battery deployment, aerodynamic mode changes, and temperature limits, all while racing at full speed. That level of complexity creates something engineers call a narrow operating window. When the car is inside that window, it feels incredible, fast, stable, precise. But when the car falls outside that window, even slightly, the balance can change dramatically. And that is exactly the kind of situation that frustrates drivers like Max Verstappen. Because throughout his career, Verstappen has thrived in cars that allow him to attack aggressively. Cars that feel predictable. Cars that respond instantly to his inputs. But if the car becomes unpredictable, if the balance changes from one corner to the next, the driver loses confidence. And in Formula One, confidence is everything. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because while several teams were struggling with these problems in China, one team looked completely comfortable. Mercedes. Their car appeared stable during the entire race. Smooth through the corners. Efficient on the straights. And perfectly controlled during the aerodynamic transitions that were causing trouble for other teams. That level of control is not easy to achieve with such complex regulations. Which is why the performance of Mercedes in Shanghai immediately raised eyebrows across the paddock. Because if one team has already mastered the new rulebook, the entire balance of power in Formula One could change very quickly. But the moment Mercedes crossed the finish line with a dominant 1-2 finish, the entire paddock noticed something immediately. Their car looked different. Not visually, but in the way it behaved. While other teams were fighting instability, electrical failures, and unpredictable balance, the Mercedes looked calm from the very first lap to the very last. Andrea Kimi Antonelli controlled the race with remarkable composure, securing the first victory of his Formula One career, while George Russell followed closely behind to complete a perfect result for the team. For Mercedes, it was the ideal start to the new era. But for the rest of the grid, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if Mercedes has already solved the biggest puzzle of the 2026 regulations? Because the real challenge of these new cars is not just building downforce. It is balancing multiple complex systems at the same time. The hybrid power unit, the active aerodynamics, the cooling systems, the chassis platform. Every one of these elements affects the others. If the hybrid system generates too much heat, cooling must increase. More cooling changes the airflow. Changes in airflow affect aerodynamic efficiency. And suddenly the entire balance of the car shifts. This is why engineers describe the 2026 regulations as an integration challenge. Everything must work together perfectly. If one element is slightly wrong, the car becomes unstable. If several elements are wrong at the same time, the car becomes unpredictable. And that unpredictability is exactly what several teams experienced in China. Red Bull lost Verstappen due to the ERS failure. McLaren never even reached the starting grid with either of their cars. Aston Martin saw Fernando Alonso retire after vibrations made the car impossible to continue driving. 3 completely different problems. 3 different teams. Yet all connected by the same underlying issue. The complexity of the new regulation package. Meanwhile, Mercedes appeared to have something the others did not. Stability. Their aerodynamic transitions looked smooth. Their hybrid deployment looked consistent. And most importantly, their drivers never appeared to be fighting the car. That is the kind of advantage that becomes extremely dangerous over a full season. Because when a team begins a new regulation cycle with a stable concept, they can focus their development on performance, while their rivals are still trying to fix reliability problems. That difference can define an entire championship. And teams inside the paddock are already aware of it. Because Formula One history has shown this pattern many times before. Whenever a new rulebook arrives, one team eventually discovers the best interpretation of the regulations. Once that happens, the rest of the grid spends months trying to catch up. And sometimes, they never fully do. That possibility is exactly why the reaction after the Chinese Grand Prix was so intense. Teams were not just analyzing their race results. They were analyzing the regulations themselves. Looking for clues. Looking for weaknesses. Trying to understand why some cars were struggling while others looked perfectly balanced. And when that kind of investigation begins, the conversation inevitably reaches the FIA. Because if teams believe the rules have unintentionally created a massive performance gap, the pressure for clarification quickly starts to build. Not immediately. Not publicly. But quietly, behind closed doors. Engineers asking questions. Team principals requesting meetings. Technical departments studying every detail of the rulebook. And that process can eventually turn political. Especially if drivers begin speaking openly about their frustrations. Which brings us back to Max Verstappen. Because when a driver of his stature retires due to reliability problems in the second race of a brand new regulation era, people pay attention. And if similar problems continue appearing across the grid in the next races, the debate around the 2026 rules could escalate very quickly. Because the FIA designed these regulations with a very clear promise. Better racing. Smarter technology. A new generation of Formula One cars that would be both exciting and sustainable. But after the chaos we witnessed in Shanghai, one question is quietly growing inside the paddock. What if the technology has become too complicated even for the teams themselves? And if that question continues to grow louder, the controversy surrounding the new regulations might only be beginning. But the real reason the FIA could be starting to worry is not just what happened in China. It is what could happen next. Because Formula One history shows a very clear pattern whenever a new regulation era begins. The first races are chaotic. Teams struggle to understand the cars. Reliability problems appear. Drivers complain about balance and unpredictable behavior. But eventually one team unlocks the secret of the regulations. And when that happens, the gap between that team and the rest of the grid can grow very quickly. That possibility is exactly what many teams are beginning to fear after the Chinese Grand Prix. Because Mercedes did not just win the race. They dominated it. Their car looked stable in every condition. Long runs, short runs, high-speed corners, low-speed sections. And most importantly, during the aerodynamic transitions that are causing problems for other teams. That stability is incredibly valuable. Because when a driver trusts the car, they can push harder, brake later, attack corners more aggressively. But when the car feels unpredictable, the driver begins to hold back. They protect the tires. They avoid risks. They manage the machine instead of racing it. And that difference can be worth several tenths of a second per lap, which is enormous in Formula One. Now imagine what happens if that difference continues over an entire season. Teams struggling with reliability. Drivers frustrated with narrow operating windows. Engineers rushing to fix problems instead of improving performance. Meanwhile, one team continues refining a concept that already works. That is how dominance begins in Formula One. And it is exactly the scenario the FIA wanted to avoid when they created the 2026 regulations. The entire goal of the new rules was to keep competition close. More overtaking. More teams fighting at the front. Less aerodynamic turbulence. But the chaos we saw in China revealed something important. The new cars may allow closer racing when everything works perfectly. But the systems controlling those cars are incredibly complicated. Active aerodynamics. Advanced hybrid deployment. Complex software controlling multiple energy systems. And every one of those systems must work together perfectly. If they do not, the car becomes fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes unable to even start the race. Which is exactly what happened to McLaren in Shanghai. Both of their cars were eliminated before the race even began due to electrical power unit problems. For a top team, that kind of failure is shocking. But it also highlights something deeper about the 2026 regulations. The electrical side of Formula One has never been more important. The hybrid system now provides a much larger share of the total power output. Energy recovery plays a bigger role in performance. And managing that energy has become one of the most difficult tasks for engineers and drivers. If that system fails, the car loses huge amounts of performance instantly. Which is exactly what happened when Verstappen's energy recovery system failed during the race. And that failure created another serious concern inside the paddock. Because when electrical systems become this important, reliability becomes incredibly difficult to guarantee. The more complex the system, the more potential points of failure it has. Sensors, software, battery temperatures, energy deployment strategies, cooling systems. All of these elements must work perfectly for the car to survive an entire race distance. And if multiple teams begin suffering failures related to those systems, the pressure on the FIA will only increase. Because drivers are already beginning to notice how demanding these cars are to manage. They must monitor energy deployment constantly. They must adapt to aerodynamic mode changes during the lap. They must manage temperatures in systems that did not exist in previous generations of Formula One. All while racing at incredible speeds. For some drivers, this new challenge is exciting. But for others, it feels like the car is becoming too dependent on technology.